Between the 1860s and the 1890s, Otto von Bismarck shaped European politics as a Prussian statesman and diplomat. He expertly masterminded the 1871 unification of Germany following his alliance and warmongering policy. He relied on realpolitik, combining diplomatic and political tools based on the prevailing circumstances. Instead of adopting moral or ethical norms, he embraced philosophical realism and pragmatism to pursue the vital interests of the state. Bismarck succeeded in maintaining Germany's leading role in Europe and preserving peace until his abdication in 1890. But this came at a cost. Otto von Bismarck was born on April 1, 1815, in Saxony. By the time Bismarck was born, Napoleon had been defeated outright by a coalition comprising a collective German force with many enthusiastic volunteers. The ensuing brilliance of this joint effort kept Bismarck's childhood filled with bloodthirsty war stories about heroism and sacrifice. His father, Karl, was a Prussian aristocrat, a Junker in the German language, with firmly conservative views. His mother, Wilhelmine, by contrast, was the daughter of a cabinet secretary and was extremely intelligent and witty. Otto turned out to be a blend of the two. Bismarck was both an ultra-conservative militarist and the harbinger of a German welfare state and universal suffrage, a modernizer whose German constitution brought real power into the emperor's and army's hands, a ruthlessly vindictive politician who was also a neurotic, semi-hysterical hypochondriac, an insomniac who could not stop eating, a Christian believer with utterly amoral methods. Standing at 1.88 meters, he was physically imposing with blue steel eyes and broad shoulders. With a sharp tongue, wit, and extraordinary eloquence, he managed to achieve his intended effect with almost any audience. Domestically and abroad, Bismarck used the threat of democracy to force kings and princes to comply with his wishes, creating a Germany that was the most dynamic power in Europe, but his brainchild was utterly flawed and impractical, partly because Bismarck designed it around himself as the ruling chancellor. Bismarck led a wandering life as a young man, trying to find purpose and meaning as the second son of a minor noble family. But in 1847, his life changed forever. During his school days, he was flamboyantly ambitious and eccentric. He courted 2 girls, but then fell in love with a charming and graceful young woman called Marie von Thadden, who had just married one of his friends. Through her influence, Bismarck embraced the evangelical pietistic Lutheranism then in vogue, but this never quelled his taste for political intrigue. Eventually, he married the simple, cantankerous, and humorless Johanna von Puttkamer, with whom he had a successful but probably dull and unhappy marriage, blessed with many children. Bismarck, at the age of 32, was elected to represent the newly created Prussian legislature in Parliament in 1847. He gained a reputation there as a monarchist and reactionary politician, with a knack for hard-hitting rhetoric and openly defending the idea that the monarch had a divine right to rule. Prussia faced a revolution in March 1848, one of the 1848 revolutions across Europe, which completely subdued King Frederick William IV. Although initially reluctant to use the armed forces to suppress the rebellion, the monarch refused to leave Berlin for the safety of the military headquarters in Potsdam. During the 1848 revolutions, Bismarck was angered by the liberal rebellion and planned to take his peasants to Berlin to support the king. He painted himself as an intransigent authoritarian, extolling the divine right of kings through a series of provocative speeches intended to draw attention to himself. His frequent advisory memos to William I, the regent, and later King of Prussia, a conservative Prussian soldier who was frank and straightforward, albeit emotional, clearly meant that Bismarck wished to act as chief minister, but he demanded total control over foreign affairs. But he was not given the post he wanted. Instead, he was appointed ambassador of the Diet of the German Confederation in Frankfurt, then in St. Petersburg, and finally in Paris. While holding these posts, and on a visit to London, Bismarck met the greatest statesmen of the time, including Napoleon III of France and the English Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Without beating around the bush and with astonishing foresight, Bismarck told Disraeli exactly how he would play the German princes of France and Austria, using war and the threat of democracy to unify Germany. Over a period of a few years, he rigorously kept his promises. In 1862, King William's crisis concerning the Prussian military spending led the monarch to appoint Bismarck as its minister-president and foreign minister. He almost immediately wrecked his position with a rash and famous speech that threatened blood and iron, in other words war, as the only way for Prussia to find its destiny in Europe. However, in partnership with War Minister Albrecht von Roon and Chief of Staff von Moltke, Bismarck set about doing just that. The Prussian rival for leadership of the many Germanic principalities was the Habsburg Empire of Austria-Hungary, ruled by Emperor Franz Joseph. Bismarck first used the crisis over the succession of the duchies of Schleswig-Holstein in Denmark to defeat the ill-fated King of Denmark and then exclude Austria from German affairs. The Germans were for centuries the overwhelming dominant settlers in Schleswig and Holstein, ruled by the Danish king. From 1848 onwards, crises were evident between the Danes and the German population living in these regions. Both were under the Danish administration. Yet, while Schleswig had a large German population, Holstein was a member of the Germanic Confederation. The constitutional efforts suggested to address the Schleswig-Holstein issue did not resolve the dispute. Ultimately, when Otto von Bismarck was appointed prime minister, he played up the crises to push it forward to the Prussian foreign policy objectives, attaining supremacy over Austria by signing an alliance in 1864, an unusual step. He did, however, ensure that German interests were protected by Prussia and Austria rather than the German Confederation. In 1864, an ultimatum was presented to Denmark by both sides, requesting the withdrawal of the constitution or else military action. Denmark rejected it. The Austro-Prussian army stormed Schleswig on February 1, 1864, disregarding the federal forces in Holstein. Following 2 sieges, the Prussian army claimed a decisive victory on April 18, 1864, when it took the Danish fortress of Dybbøl. The conflict raged on until the end of June, easing Bismarck's plan to keep the Schleswig-Holstein question out of the international arena. Right from the start of the war, Austrian and Prussian policies concerning the duchies were intrinsically contradictory, and conflict seemed inevitable. Denmark was finally defeated, and the Convention of Gastein, on August 14, 1865, settled this apparent discrepancy by allotting the internal affairs of Holstein to Austria and those of Schleswig to Prussia. The Prussian-Danish War helped Prussia disentangle itself from federal politics. Apart from taking control of Schleswig, Otto von Bismarck gathered support in the nationalist forces of parliament at the nationwide level. Yet the Gastein Peace Conference proved to be short-lived, as Austria and Prussia entered a 7-week territorial war not long after the defeat of Denmark. Otto von Bismarck's next political achievement on the road to German unification was to remove Austria entirely from the German Confederation and achieve full control in the northern part. Otto von Bismarck's goal before the war was to keep Great Britain, France, and Russia neutral in the event of an armed conflict between Prussia and Austria. By then, Britain was more concerned about Austrian might and would not get caught up in the war. France opted to deplete both geopolitical rivals. Russia even found an ally in Prussia against the Poles. Bismarck's intention to establish Prussian hegemony in northern Germany began to manifest itself. In 1866, he maneuvered Austria into fighting a war in which Emperor Franz Joseph was defeated at the Battle of Königsgrätz, effectively ending Austrian claims to an active role in Germany. Prussia then annexed several German kingdoms, including Hanover, forming a strong new European power. Bismarck's next objective was to unite the southern German states into the North German Confederation under his leadership. French influence in the southern parts of Germany was overwhelming. Conflict with France seemed unavoidable, as France, on the other hand, feared the growing dominance of Prussia in Europe. He was appointed Count. His power depended exclusively on the King of Prussia. In fact, he had no party. But Wilhelm, in turn, had become dependent on Bismarck. Crises were settled by Bismarck's brooding, his hypochondria on his threats to resign, and he had considerable difficulty maintaining royal support, as he was hated by Queen Augusta, as well as by Crown Prince Frederick and his wife Victoria, Queen Victoria's liberal daughter. "It's not easy to be a monarch under Bismarck," said Kaiser Wilhelm. A fitting climate for the Franco-Prussian War dawned in 1870, Following the 1868 Spanish Revolution, Queen Isabella II was deposed. The Spanish Parliament looked for a new candidate in the throne. In June 1870, the Prussian Chancellor and de facto leader of Spain, Juan Prim, convinced Leopold, a relative of the Prussian royal house, the Hohenzollerns, to accept the Spanish crown. This greatly alarmed Napoleon III of France, who felt undermined by the prospect of bordering countries ruled by representatives of the Prussian dynasty on both sides. His well-known French arrogance was put to effective use by Bismarck. He simply tampered with a French telegram in such a way to insult King Wilhelm, who grew indignant. The French declared war, but were utterly defeated by the Prussians at the Battle of Sedan. Emperor Napoleon III then abdicated, was arrested, and became a prisoner. His victory allowed him to unify Germany into a new empire, the Second Reich. Wilhelm I was the emperor, or rather the Kaiser in the German language, and Bismarck was eventually prime minister. Besides, he was given the title of prince. The Treaty of Frankfurt, signed on January 28, 1871, concluded the Franco-Prussian War. Alsace and the eastern part of Lorraine, inhabited by German speakers, were handed over to Prussia. The 1870 Franco-Prussian War had two consequences. It ended French domination in Europe, and the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine was the definitive step towards the reunification of Germany. The German Empire was established on January 18, 1871, when King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed Emperor of Germany at Versailles. This radically changed the Congress of Europe and triggered a fundamental shift in European balance of power in the 19th century. Having established the German Empire, Bismarck expertly pursued a policy of maintaining dominance and averting large-scale armed conflicts within Europe. To this objective, he steered the principles of keeping France under control, to avoid French revanchism. The second goal was to keep amicable relations and form an alliance with Austria and Russia, the two other great powers. A unified Germany blended a veneer of universal suffrage, parliamentary democracy, and a modern industrial economy with the reality of authoritarian, tight-fisted military rule led by the Kaiser, aristocratic Junker army officers, and of course, Bismarck himself. Actual power remained with the Kaiser, but it was a complex system which only Bismarck, with his singular status and unique political genius, could manage and control. Although admitting that he was bored, Bismarck ruled for almost 2 decades following the creation of the German Empire, directing a cultural campaign to attack Catholic power, at times allying himself with socialists, at other times fostering conservative policies, creating a welfare state, promoting foreign alliances with Austria and Russia, and simultaneously aiming to maintain the European balance of power, fearful that one day the Great European War would happen due to some damn fool thing in the Balkans setting it off. Bismarck's years in power as Chancellor of Germany saw no major wars in Europe, but as 1864 to 1870 showed, he used the war to extensively promote Prussian political interests. On the contrary, the 2-decade peace resulted from his realpolitik. The newly established and unified Germany needed peace to progress economically, while further expansionism would mean confrontation with other great powers. Bismarck's diplomatic endeavors to appease Austria and Russia, as well as his success in enticing these two countries into a defensive alliance with Germany, ensured that France would remain isolated. Bismarck's power eventually staggered as he grew older, and after his benefactor, Wilhelm, died in 1888. He was succeeded as Kaiser by Crown Prince Frederick III, who was tragically already dying of cancer. Following a short reign, his throne was taken by the young, brash, and unbalanced Kaiser Wilhelm II, who in 1890 called for the Chancellor's resignation. Bismarck was 75 years old, but he was enraged by his downfall. He had established Germany and a new Europe, but his successors, particularly Kaiser Wilhelm II, could not control his creation. Bismarck spent his last years drafting his memoirs, a work that has been praised by historians. Through his writings, he continued his rivalry with Wilhelm II by attacking him, heightening the drama around each event, and often presenting himself in a favorable light. His health began to deteriorate in 1896. He was diagnosed with gangrene in his foot, but refused to accept treatment. As a result, he had difficulty walking and often used a wheelchair. By July 1898, he was in a wheelchair full-time, struggled to breathe, and was almost constantly feverish and in pain. He died on July 30th, 1898, at the age of 83. His eldest son, Herbert, succeeded him as Prince Bismarck. He earned posthumous contempt from William II by having his own sarcophagus inscribed with the words, "A loyal German servant of Emperor Wilhelm I." When Bismarck resigned, the Eastern Bloc collapsed, France strengthened while Russia took on its own in the Balkans, and eventually, the First World War broke out. By the time of his death in 1898, Bismarck was an embittered man. His successors allowed the new German Kaiser Wilhelm II to direct policy from 1890. As a result, European tensions began to mount and swallow up the newly formed Germany. But Bismarck also inspired a cult following that would continue long after his death. Hundreds of monuments, such as the famous Bismarck Towers, were built in his honor throughout the German Empire. Many consider him a brilliant statesman.